A deep crimson glow painted the night sky as the small escape pod tore through. Earth's atmosphere, its metal hull burned against the friction, leaving a fiery trail in its wake before crashing into the dense forest below. The impact sent shock waves through the trees, birds scattering into the air as silence followed inside the wreckage. A girl barely clung to consciousness. Leia had never felt pain like this before. Her body ached from the impact. Her lungs struggled against the unfamiliar atmosphere, and the cold, damp air sent chills through her thin clothing. Blinking rapidly, she tried to focus, her senses overloaded by the strange earthy scents around her. The soil, the leaves, the distant scent of something burning. It was all so new. She tried to stand but collapsed instantly, her limbs trembling beneath her. Fear gripped her chest. She was alone. Her people had always warned her about planets like this, chaotic, unpredictable, and most of all dangerous. Humans were not to be trusted. They were primitive, ruled by emotion, and they valued their own above all else. But Leia had no choice. Her own ship had been destroyed, and her escape pod had malfunctioned. She had nowhere to go, no way to contact anyone. As she lay there, barely able to keep her eyes open, the sound of footsteps echoed through the forest. "What the hell?" a voice muttered. Leia tensed, her heart pounding in her chest. A figure approached cautiously, stepping closer. His clothes were strange, loose fabric covering his body, a thick jacket shielding him from the night's cold. He had dark, unkempt hair and tired eyes that widened the moment they landed on Nolan. Had seen many strange things in his life. Growing up near a military base meant the occasional secret experiment or test flight overhead, but this was something entirely different. His first instinct was to run, but as he looked at the figure lying before him, trembling and clearly hurt, he hesitated. She was young, barely older than a teenage nature. Maybe her features were human enough, but something about her was off. Her skin had a faint shimmer under the moonlight, and her eyes, a deep violet, held an intensity he had never seen before. "Are you okay?" he asked hesitantly, kneeling down. Leia flinched, her instincts screaming at her to get away. She tried to push herself back, but her arms gave out. Nolan raised his hands, trying to show he meant no harm. "Easy, I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't believe him. She had been GED'd on caution, on the knowledge that trust was a weakness, but right now she had no strength left to fight. Nolan hesitated for a long moment before "Saya, damn it," he muttered under his breath. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he couldn't just leave her here. Reaching out slowly, he wrapped an arm under her shoulders, supporting her weight as she weakly protested in a language he didn't understand. "Look, you're freezing. You're hurt. I don't know who you are or where you came from, but if I leave you here you won't last." The night elf's vision blurred as exhaustion overtook her. She barely registered the warmth of his touch, the strange sensation of being cared for rather than left behind. Her people would have abandoned the weak, but this human, he wasn't walking away. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was his face, eyes filled not with fear or anger, but with something else entirely: concern. And for the first time in her life, she wondered if everything she had been told about humans was wrong. A streak of fire tore through the night sky, momentarily turning darkness into daylight. The small escape pod plummeted toward the surface, metal groaning under the immense pressure inside. Leia gritted her teeth, her fingers gripping the broken control panel. Her heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to stabilize the descent, but the pod had taken too much damage. It was beyond her control now. With a deafening crash, the pod slammed into the earth. Trees snapped like twigs, dirt and debris exploding into the air as the impact cratered the forest floor. Smoke hissed from the wreckage, the acrid scent of burning metal mixing with the dampness of the soil. Leia barely remained conscious. Pain surged through her limbs, sharp and relentless. Her breathing was ragged as she forced herself to move her body, resisting every attempt. She groaned softly, violet eyes flickering open to take in her surroundings. The world around her was so different from her home. Instead of the soft glow of bioluminescent trees and silver rivers, there were towering, darkened pines their jagged silhouettes swaying in the cold night breeze instead of the crisp, sterile air of her planet. There was the earthy scent of damp wood moss and the lingering smoke of her crash panics. Settled in her chest, she was alone her people had always warned her about. Planets like this, primitive, chaotic, and dangerous. The humans who lived here were selfish, ruled by their emotions, and they feared anything different from them. If found her, they would not help her, they would cage her, study her, or worse, kill her. Luria forced herself to move, pain shooting up her legs as she crawled out of the wreckage. The night air bit at her exposed skin, her thin, torn uniform offering little protection. A sharp pain bloomed in her side, and when she glanced down, she saw a deep gash along her ribs. Blue blood oozed from the wound, staining her fingers as she pressed a trembling hand against it. She was weak, vulnerable, and she had it. Her people did not show weakness. Strength was survival, and the weak were left behind. If she couldn't protect herself, then she didn't deserve to live. Her vision swam as she stumbled forward, forcing her aching body away from the crash site. She needed to hide, needed to find shelter before the humans arrived, but her strength was fading and the pain was overwhelming. Then she heard it, footsteps, heavy boots crunching against the forest floor. Moving closer, his breath hitched. Fierce surged through her, raw and uncontrollable. She pressed herself against a nearby tree, hard hammering. As the footsteps grew louder, a figure emerged from the darkness. A human. He was tall, his form barely visible in the dim moonlight. He wore loose, raw-looking clothing, denim, and a thick jacket that looked worn from use. His dark hair was messy, his face shadowed but sharp, with eyes that scanned the area wearily. Luria held her breath, her mind racing. Should she run, attack, beg for mercy? She didn't get the chance to decide. What the hell? The human muttered under his breath, eyes locking onto her. Lia flinched. He had seen her a long moment past, both of them frozen in place. The human's expression flickered with something unreadable, confusion, concern, and something else she couldn't quite place. Then cautiously, he took a step closer. Luria tensed every muscle in her body, screaming at her to move, to get away. Are you okay? He asked hesitantly, his voice softer than she expected. She didn't understand the words, but the tone. It wasn't hostile. Still, she didn't trust him. With what little strength she had left, she tried to push herself away, stumbling backward, but the pain in her ribs flared, and her vision blurred. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the cold ground. The human moved forward, instantly reaching out. Lia let out a weak, involuntary sound of protest as his hands hovered near her, hesitant but steady. Hey, easy, easy. I'm not going to hurt you. She understood nothing of what he said, but his tone was gentle, a sharp contrast to everything she had been taught about humans. Still, she didn't believe him. She had no reason to. Her breath came in short, painful gasps as she pressed a hand to her wound, fingers trembling against the slick blood. The human's gaze flickered downward, and his brows furrowed. You're bleeding, he murmured. Lia knew that tone. She had heard it before from her own kind, but never directed at her. It was concerned worry. But why would a human care? She tried to move again, but the exhaustion was too much. Her body was giving up. The human hesitated for only a second before muttering something under his breath. Then, before she could protest, he reached down and carefully lifted her into his arms. Larry stiffened, every instinct screaming at her to fight back. But there was no violence in his grip, no cruelty, just warmth. Damn it, you're freezing, he muttered, adjusting his hold. I don't know what the hell you are, but I can't just leave you here. Lia's head rested against his chest, too weak to resist, too drained to even keep her eyes open. She had spent her whole life believing that humans would never help her, and yet, as her consciousness faded, the last thing she felt was safety. Ria drifted in and out of consciousness, her body swaying gently with each step the human took. She was dimly aware of the strong arms holding her, the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. It was unfamiliar, comforting in a way she didn't understand. She should be fighting, she should be resisting, but her strength was gone, her body betraying her with exhaustion and pain. The human's voice rumbled through her, though she couldn't make out his words. His tone wasn't harsh, or threatening, it carried a strange warmth, not the cold detachment of her own people, not the distant judgment she had grown up with. Why would a human be gentle? She tried to lift her head, but the movement centered sharp pain through her ribs, making her gasp softly, the human still glancing down at her. "Hey," he murmured, "you still with me?" She didn't understand him, but she recognized the concern in his voice. It made her stomach twist with confusion. Humans weren't supposed to care. Her vision blurred as exhaustion pulled at her again, but she forced herself to stay awake. She had to remember everything if she survived this. She needed to understand, why hadn't he left her to die? The world around them was dark, the towering trees casting long shadows. Under the moonlight, a distant howl echoed through the forest, and the human picked up his pace. His grip on her tightened slightly, as if protecting her. Protecting her, the thought made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with her injuries. She didn't deserve protection, but the human carried her through the forest without hesitation. Finally emerging into a clearing where a small wooden structure stood. It was old, with patches of the roof repaired, and a single truck parked out front. A warm glow flickered through one of the windows. Laya tried to move again as he stepped onto the porch, her weak struggle barely noticeable. "Whoa, easy," the human muttered. "I'm not going to drop you." He nudged the door open with his foot. Stepping inside, the sudden warmth was overwhelming. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting soft golden light across the room. The air smelled of burning wood, leather, and something unfamiliar yet strangely pleasant. The human carried her to a worn-out couch and gently set her down. The moment his arms left her, she felt the absence cold and unfamiliar. She forced herself upright, wincing at the sharp pain in her side. Her vision spun, but she bit her lip, forcing herself to stay conscious. She wouldn't show weakness. The human crouched in front of her, watching her closely. His gaze flickered to her wound, his expression tightening. "You need help," he muttered. Luria did understand his words, but she saw the way he hesitated before reaching for something nearby, a box filled with strange objects. Her body tensed, a weapon. Her breath hitched, panic clawing at her chest. She had been a fool to think a human would help her. She had to get away, but before she could even attempt to move, the human raised his hand slightly. His expression softened, his voice quieter. "Relax," he said slowly. "I'm just getting the first aid kit first." Aid? She didn't recognize the words, but his tone. There was no hostility, no aggression. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was reaching for something to help her. Luria didn't move as he pulled out a roll of strange material in a small bottle. "This is going to sting," he warned. She barely had time to react before he poured the liquid over her wound. Fire, a sharp burning pain erupted through her side. Luria cried out, instinctively recoiling, but the human caught her shoulder, steadying her. "I know," he said, his voice lower. "It hurts, but it'll stop the infection." Luria clenched her teeth, breathing hard. She didn't understand his words, but she understood his tone, and she hated that it made her feel safe. She watched him carefully as he worked, pressing the material against her wound and wrapping it tightly. His movements were strangely precise, efficient but gentle. No human was supposed to treat her like this. No one had ever treated her like this. Once he was finished, he leaned back, studying his work there. He muttered, "That should hold." Luria swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wasn't sure what to say, not that he would understand her anyway. After a long moment of silence, the human sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Well," he muttered, "I guess I should introduce myself." He gestured to himself. "I'm Callan." Luria frowned slightly. Callan, his name. She hesitated before speaking. For the first time, her voice was horror weak. "Luria." Callan blinked, then gave a small nod. "Luria," he repeated. It was strange hearing a human say her name. Another long silence passed before Sin pushed himself up, stretching. "You need rest," he said, though he knew she wouldn't understand. He pointed toward the couch. "Then mind sleeping." Luria hesitated. He was offering her a place to rest. Why? But her body was exhausted. The warmth of the cabin was making her eyelids heavy, the fire's soft crackle lulling her into something dangerously close to comfort. Callan watched her for a moment, then sighed. "I'll be in the other room if you need anything," he said, stepping away. Luria didn't move as he walked to another, doorway disappearing from sight. She was alone, safe, and for the first time in her life, she didn't know what to do with it. Feeling, Lyra woke to the scent of something warm and unfamiliar. Her body etched the tight bandages across her wound, reminding her of the events from the night before. She blinked against the soft glow of the fire, her sharp ears catching the faint sounds of movement. In the next room, the human Callan was still. Here for a moment she stayed still. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to escape before he changed his mind. Humans weren't supposed to be kind, they were dangerous, unpredictable, yet she shifted, testing the pain in her side. It was there, but dulled. He had helped her. Why? The question noted her as she slowly pushed herself up. The couch was softer than anything she had slept on before, and the warmth of the fire made her body relax against her will. She should be cold and alone in the dark. That was how it had always been, but here in this strange place she felt safe. She hated it. The scent from before drifted through the air again, rich, savory. Her stomach twisted with an unfamiliar sensation. Hunger. Lia had gone days without food. Before, her people only ate when necessary, and they never wasted resources. But this smell, whatever Callan was making, her body craved it. She swallowed and slowly stood, steadying herself against the arm of the couch. The movement sent a soft creak through the wooden floor. Almost immediately, Callan's voice came from the next room. "You're up." Lyra froze. She heard his footsteps, and then he was standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable at first, but then his gaze flickered to her side, checking the bandages. "You shouldn't be moving around." Yet he muttered. She didn't understand the words, but the concern in his voice was unmistakable. Lia's eyes darted to the small table behind him. A metal pot sat on top of something glowing faintly, steam rising from it. Callan followed her gaze, then let out a small chuckle. "You're probably hungry," he said. Lia's stomach betrayed her, letting out a soft growl. She clenched her jaw. Embarrassed, Ken didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't mock her for it. Instead, he turned and grabbed something, a bowl. She washed cautiously as he laid some of the steaming liquid into it, then placed it on the table. He grabbed a metal utensil and gestured toward it. "Go ahead," he said. Lyra didn't move. She knew better than to accept things from others. Kindness was always followed by expectations. If someone gave you something, it meant they wanted something in return. But he hadn't asked for anything. He had saved her life. He had treated her wound, and now he was giving her food. What did he want? Callan sighed. When she didn't react, he picked up the bowl and walked over, crouching in front of her. Slowly, he set it down near her feet and backed away. Lia stared at it. The scent filled her lungs and her stomach twisted painfully. She hesitated for only a moment longer before giving in. With slow, careful movements, she reached forward, grabbing the bowl. The heat seeped into her fingers, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. She lifted it cautiously to her lips and took a sip. Warmth it spread through her, soothing her throat, filling the emptiness inside her. The taste was strange, salty, rich, unlike anything she had ever eaten. She had to stop herself from drinking it. Fat Callan watched her for a moment, then gave a small, satisfied nod. "Good," he muttered. "You'll need your strength." Lia finished the bowl in silence, her mind racing. She had expected this human to be cruel, to mock her weakness. Instead, he had given her warmth. She didn't know how to respond. After a long moment, she finally looked up at him, studied him. Ken met her gaze, his expression calm for the first time. She forced herself to say something. His brows furrowed slightly. What she struggled with, a human word, the strange sound unfamiliar on her tongue. "Why?" she repeated slower this time. Callan exhaled, rubbing a hand through his hair. "Because you needed help," he said simply. Lia didn't understand. She had never needed anyone. No one had ever helped her. But this human Calate, and for the first time in her life, she didn't know if she should be afraid of that. Lia sat in silence, staring at the empty bowl in her hands. The warmth of the soup lingered in her stomach, unfamiliar yet oddly comforting. Callan had returned to the kitchen, giving her space as if sensing that she needed time to process Everything she had asked why, and his answer still made no sense. Humans didn't help without reason. They weren't supposed to, yet Callan had given her shelter, food, safety, and he hadn't asked for anything in return. The thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She had to know more. Laura placed the bowl down carefully before standing. She tested her balance, relieved that the dizziness had faded. Her body was still weak, but she had endured far worse. She stepped forward, slow and cautious, peering into the next room where Callan stood washing dishes in a strange metal basin filled with water. The house was small but sturdy. The wooden floors creaked softly under her weight, and the walls were lined with objects she didn't understand. Strange squares covered one side of the room, filled with images, humans, landscapes, animals. Were they his family, friends? Luria frowned. She had never seen anything like this. Her people lived in cold, barren cities. Function over comfort. Everything had a purpose. There was no space for decoration, no room for sentiment. Yet here in this simple home there was warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She didn't know how to feel about that. Ken noticed her watching and turned slightly dry, his hands on a cloth. "We're walking better," he observed. Luria hesitated before nodding. She didn't trust her voice, yet Callan leaned against the counter, studying her. "You're not used to people being nice, huh?" She stiffened. He said it so casually, as if it were a simple fact, but the words struck deeper than she wanted to admit. "No," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Callan sighed. He didn't look surprised. He gestured to a chair at the table, silently offering her a seat. After a brief hesitation, she accepted. For a moment neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint crackling of the fire. Then Callan broke the silence. "Where are you from?" Luria stiffened again. The question shouldn't have felt so dangerous, but it did. Far. Callan raised an eyebrow at her vague answer. "Not much of a talker." "Huh." She glared at him, but there was no real anger behind it. He was teasing her. That was new to Callan. Sigh again and leaned back in his chair. "All right," he said, "you don't have to tell me anything you don't want to." That surprised her. He wasn't demanding answers. He wasn't pushing. Luria didn't know what to do with that. She sat in silence, staring at her hands. She could leave. Her strength was returning. She could slip away into the night, disappear, like she always did. But the thought made something tighten in her chest. She wasn't ready to go back to being alone. Not yet. Callan stood and grabbed something from a nearby shelf, the soft piece of fabric. He walked over and placed it beside her. "A blanket," he explained. "I figured you might still be cold." Luria looked at it, then back at him. He was giving her something again. No expectations, no demands, just kindness. She swallowed hard and picked it up, the soft material strange against her fingers. "Thank you," she murmured. Ken gave her a small smile before turning away. Luria held the blanket close, feeling something she couldn't quite name. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Luria sat by the fire, the warmth seeping into her skin as she clutched the soft blanket Callan had given her. She had never owned anything that was truly hers before. Everything in her life had always been assigned, borrowed, or temporary. She glanced at Ken, who was busy fixing something at the table. He had a way of moving so naturally in his space, like he belonged here, like this place was truly his home. The word felt strange to her, foreign. Her people did not have homes like this. They had stations, outposts, structures meant to house, but not comfort. Nothing like the wooden walls, the pictures, the small decorations Callan had scattered around his house. She had been trained to survive, never to settle. But now she didn't want to leave. Luria took a deep breath. She wasn't good with words, especially not ones that mattered. But if she didn't speak now, she might never get the chance. "Why are you helping me?" Callan glanced, stop, raising an eyebrow at her sudden question. "You really don't trust anyone, do you?" She frowned, but didn't deny it. Callan sighed, setting down his tools and leaning back in his chair. "You needed help. I could help, that's all there is to it." She shook her head. "That's not how things work." "Maybe not where you're from," he admitted, "but here it's different." Luria studied him carefully. She had spent so long expecting cruelty, betrayal, or indifference. The idea that someone could simply be kind for no reason was harder to accept than anything else. "I don't understand humans." Callan chuckled. That's fair. We're a strange bunch, she hesitated, then asked. And what does it mean to be considered family? The question made Callan pause. He seemed to think about it before. Answering family isn't just about blood. He said it's about trust, loyalty, knowing someone will stand by you no matter what. Leah swallowed. That was a concept she had never experienced before. Her people valued strength, efficiency, obedience. If you were weak, you were discarded. If you failed, you were forgotten. She had never been important to anyone but Callan. He looked at her like she mattered, like she belonged. She wasn't sure how to process that. Callan must have noticed the turmoil in her expression, because his voice softened. You don't have to figure it all out today, he said. You can stay as long as you need to. Something tightened in her chest. He was offering her a choice, a real choice. She could leave, return to the life she had known, or she could stay. Slowly Luria nodded. I think I'd like to stay. Callan smiled as if he had expected that answer. Then welcome home. For the first time in her life, Luria had a place to belong, a place where she wasn't a soldier, a survivor, or a burden. She was just Luria. And maybe she was finally home. The end.